In 1066, Tears to Many Mothers, you're going to be taking on the roles of the invading Normans and the defending Saxons. Your aim will be to destroy 2 out of 3 wedge cards at the final Battle of Hastings, or to kill your opponent's leader, or perhaps force them to run through their faction-specific deck of player cards. And ultimately, this is a pretty straightforward game. There's not really any deck building because you've got a pre-assembled fixed deck of cards that you're going to be working with depending on your faction. And the mechanisms of play are pretty straightforward. You're taking a couple of cards each round from your deck, playing those. You can trigger the action of a played card. You can trigger cards that have an immediate effect sometimes. But it's overall quite a simple game. But don't let that fool you, because there's a huge amount of historical theme and flavor that's packed into this game. The fact that the designers were able to deconstruct the historic Battle of Hastings and then reconstruct it as a card game with a very light footprint and a pretty simple set of rules is no mean feat and really deserves a huge amount of respect. And the other thing I think about this game you're going to notice is the artwork. It's really beautiful. It just looks so evocative. It just looks so evocative and thematic and detailed, and I think that adds a huge amount to the gameplay experience. In each game, you're going to be moving through a set sequence of objectives depending which faction you're playing, and once you've cleared those objectives, they're kind of like beating bosses in a video game or something. You get to the final battle here, and hopefully by that stage you would have built out your full tableau of 3x3 cards so you can compete in the final Battle of Hastings. And the way that final battle happens is that you'll be comparing column by column your morale, or zeal it's called in the game, and your strength. And whoever has the most strength, either through zeal or raw power, military power, is going to add a damage token to the relevant wedge card. If you get up to 10 damage on that wedge card, you take it. If you get 2 of those, you win the game. So the game is relatively simple. It's a kind of game that you can play at a somewhat leisurely pace. You can actually have a conversation. You can be sipping on your coffee or your beer in a cafe or a pub while you're playing this. Doesn't take up too much room, so it's quite flexible in that sense, and it's an enjoyable experience. You're kind of going on this historic adventure together and experiencing the different events and the different characters, and it is somewhat like a history lesson recreated in a card game format, which again, that may not sound amazing to some people, but I'm saying it as a compliment. It was a really interesting experience to play through that history in more depth. I've grown up knowing about the history of this battle. I visited Hastings a number of times, especially when I was a kid, so it was really interesting to get a little bit more detail and a little bit more depth of knowledge through the historical aspect of this game. Now, I think on the flip side, some of the things I didn't really like about this game were that it felt like it is probably a game that's going to be somewhat rigid, somewhat on rails, because you're moving through the same set of sequences each time, the same set of objective cards. You're going to be doing some of the same things. You're also moving through the same deck because you're not deck building. You're always going to have the same deck depending on which faction you play, and that will be a constant from game to game. However, of course, you're going to be playing different cards. You're going to be playing them in different timings. You're going to be playing them in different ways, so that will make a difference and add variety and longevity to the game. However, compared to some other card games that I've played that are combative, this feels a little bit rigid and a little bit less interactive because, you know, you're really not doing much to the other side. Now, you will get a card from time to time that allows you to damage one of their units or put some other effect, a negative effect, across to your opponent, but there's not a huge amount of interaction. You may, for example, get something like an archer that lets you shoot across the wedge cards and damage your opponent, but overall, there's not a huge amount of back and forth. It's definitely nothing like a game like Star Realms where you're, you know, every turn you're sort of directly attacking each other. It's more of a slow build up here. And then I think that's the other part of the problem for me, is that when you get to the end of the game, in the Battle of Hastings itself, you're sort of geared up. You've got this massive army that's assembled on either side of the battlefield, waiting to sort of fly at each other and let steel and sort of swords and shields mesh in a massive blur of combat. You really don't feel that it's anything as dynamic or as engaging as that. It's much more of a sort of And I think that's one of the other aspects of the game. However, one of the other aspects of the game, but when you're building up to this final battle in Hastings, it can feel a little bit anticlimactic. You know, you've built up these armies of, you know, got your 3x3 grid of cards, you've built up these units, and you're sort of standing across the battlefield from your opponent, and you're expecting a furious and ferocious battle, clashes of steel and wooden shields, and, you know, arrows flying across, but you really end up just doing a kind of mathematical calculation, column by column. Who's got the most zeal? Who's got the most power? Great, they get to add one of their damage tokens to that wedge. Cool, let's go to the next one. Okay, again, who's got the most power? So after all that sort of in-depth thematic journey that you're taking, after you played all these different character cards and unit cards, what have you, to build up your army, to kind of have it culminate in this mathematical arithmetic calculation is a little bit underwhelming, and that fell a little flat. So you've kind of got a game of two halves. On the one hand, it's very thematic, the artwork is beautiful, it's enjoyable, it's got a small footprint. The solo mode is really, really nicely integrated, by the way, as another important point here. But at the same token, it feels a little bit rigid. It's a little bit dry. And I think the final point for me, which is a little bit nitpicky, is that the game box is about 3 times the size that it needs to be. It's one of the most oversized board game boxes I've ever come across, which for somebody like myself who has a small collection and a single shelf where I store my games, is kind of a problem. And again, that may be nitpicky, that may be a little bit of a trivial concern for other people, but for me it was actually an issue. So overall, I think despite the beauty of this game and the historical depth of this game, it wasn't one that I've kept in my collection. But I highly recommend that if you are interested in the history, if you're interested in the artwork and the theme of this game, do check it out. It's definitely worth experiencing. It's definitely worth playing. Even if it's not one that I'm going to be keeping in my collection for the long term, you know, I have to be quite selective about the games that I keep. There's a lot of factors because I've got a very small collection. I can't always keep games, even if I enjoy them quite a bit. I've got to be very selective. So if you like the theme, you like the history, do check this one out. 1066, Tears to Many Mothers. Very clever game, very beautiful looking game, and very historically evocative game.